-30, no fire, no food, only a dog between him and death. The storm had buried every path, erased every footprint, yet somehow one set of tracks pressed on through the white oblivion. Elias Carter shivered, pressing his coat tighter around his frail body, feeling the icy wind slice through him like knives. He could barely breathe. Each inhalation burned his lungs. He looked down at the small black dog at his side, ears flattened, teeth chattering, eyes wide and alert. Shadow, he would later call him, though he had no way to know if the dog had a name or a past or even a reason for following him. All Elias knew was that the dog had chosen him, and that meant he had to keep going. There was no other choice. He trudged forward, each step a struggle against snow that rose past his knees. The landscape was alien, a monochrome nightmare of white and gray. Every tree was weighed down by ice, every branch cracked under the relentless weight, every shadow seemed to hide death. He could hear the storm howling through the forest, a deafening sound that made his teeth rattle and his eyes water. The cold burned his fingertips, making even the simplest motions excruciating. His pack was empty except for a small knife, a few scraps of bread, and the walking stick he had used for decades. Not enough to survive, not enough to fight the winter. Hours passed, though Elias had no sense of time. The sky had darkened to a gray so thick it was hard to distinguish night from day. He tried to strike flint, sparks flying against frozen rocks, dying instantly as the wind stole them. Shadow whimpered beside him, pushing against his leg as if to remind him that there was still life here, still a reason to fight. Elias swallowed hard, forcing himself to calm down, to focus. Panic would kill him faster than the cold. He had survived winters before, harsh winters, but never like this. Never when the wind screamed so loudly, never when the snow seemed endless, never when death was not just possible, but expected. He remembered the firewood stacked near his cabin before he set out. It had been buried by yesterday's snowfall. He had no way back. The storm had erased the familiar paths, flattened the landscape, and transformed the forest into a vast, unending maze of ice. He had only memory to guide him, and memory was faltering under fatigue and fear. Shadow pressed against his chest, warmth radiating, a tiny barrier against the numbing cold. Elias hugged the dog tightly, whispering, "We survive together." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Night fell faster than he expected. The cold deepened. Snowflakes whipped sideways, stinging exposed skin. His lips were chapped, his eyes watering, but he could not stop moving. He had to find shelter, anything. A fallen tree, a rock overhang, something to break the storm's assault. He spotted a large fallen pine, its branches creating a crude shelter. He crawled beneath it, pressing the dog close to his chest. Hours crawled like days. Each gust of wind felt like a blade slicing his back. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. Shadow rested his head on Elias' arm as though sensing the danger, and Elias spoke softly, "Hold on, boy. Hold on." Hunger gnawed at him, but there was nothing to eat. The bread in his pack was gone within the first day. He tried to melt snow in his hands, licking tiny amounts to stave off thirst, knowing that it would only make the cold worse. He thought about his late wife, about the winters they had survived together, about the small comforts of a warm cabin and a roaring fire. All of it gone. Now it was only him, Shadow, and the frozen wilderness. Each night the wind screamed. Each day the snow deepened. Frostbite began to take hold of his toes and fingers, numbness creeping slowly, insidiously. Pain became a dull echo, replaced by the constant roar of the storm and the desperate need to survive. Yet despite all this, Elias forced himself forward. He reminded himself of something he had learned long ago. Survival was not about strength alone. It was about patience, about cleverness, about refusing to give in when every part of the world was telling you to stop. He used the walking stick to probe the snow ahead, checking for hidden holes, ice traps, or unstable ground. Shadow followed closely, sniffing, alert. On occasion, the dog would bark or growl, a warning, a tiny shield against unseen predators. Wolves roamed this forest, scavengers waiting for mistakes, and Elias knew that one slip could be fatal. Days blurred together. He built small shelters from branches and ice, barely enough to break the wind. He rationed his minimal food, melting snow for water and eating frozen berries when he could find them. Shadow was both company and lifeline, his body providing warmth, his instinct guiding Elias in ways the old man could not always understand. Frostbite worsened, hunger gnawed relentlessly, and sleep was impossible with the wind tearing at the makeshift shelter. He hallucinated sometimes, visions of his wife, of warmth, of a fire, of being back in the cabin, but the illusions only reminded him of what he was fighting to hold on to. And yet, they survived. Somehow, day after day, they moved forward. They avoided the deepest snowdrifts, navigated around cliffs, followed frozen streams for direction. Every small victory, a branch that could be broken for fire, a patch of berries, a shallow cave, was celebrated silently, shared between man and dog. Shadow never left his side. The dog became more than a companion. It became a reason to survive, a lifeline, the only other heartbeat in a world of white death. Each day, Elias grew weaker, slower, more fragile, but he endured. He endured because Shadow endured. And in the frozen wilderness, sometimes endurance was the difference between life and death. The storm continued, relentless, unending. Trees cracked, snow fell in impossible sheets, and the wind screamed like a chorus of ghosts. Yet Elias and Shadow pushed on. Each step, each breath, each heartbeat was a challenge. They were alone in the frozen wilderness, facing -30 degrees, hunger, frostbite, and the possibility of never being found. And still they survived, one step at a time, one day at a time. Shadow pressed close, ears alert, eyes bright, a small beacon of hope in the endless white. And as the night fell and the storm howled, Elias whispered to the dog, "We will survive this, we have to." And somehow, through sheer will, through loyalty, through determination, they did. Elias had always believed he could endure the worst winters, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced. As a young man, he had spent decades working in the forests, cutting timber, hunting, and trapping. He knew the subtle signs of approaching storms, the way the clouds gathered, the way the wind whispered warnings through the trees. He remembered lessons from his father and grandfather, the old ways of survival passed down over generations, and he thought those lessons would be enough. But standing there now, snow lashing against his face, frost seeping into his bones, he realized how small and fragile human skill was against nature at its most brutal. Shadow padded close, as if sensing the old man's hesitation. Elias looked down at the dog, noticing how its fur, matted and frozen in places, glistened under the dim light that managed to filter through the storm. There was intelligence in those eyes, a calm focus that belied the chaos surrounding them. Elias wondered briefly where the dog had come from, why it had chosen to follow him, but he quickly dismissed such thoughts. Speculation was useless here. Survival required attention, focus, and action, not questions. He needed shelter and fast. Using his walking stick, Elias probed the snow in front of him, searching for a natural overhang or hollow that could protect them, even minimally, from the wind. Every step was a labor. The snow crunched loudly beneath his boots, each sound echoing in the silence between the gusts of wind. Hours felt like days. Eventually, he found a depression beneath a cluster of broken trees. It was shallow, barely big enough for them to curl up together, but it would have to do. He set to work immediately, gathering branches, piling snow around the edges, trying to create a crude windbreak. Shadow helped in his own way, nudging small sticks toward him, sitting alertly whenever a gust threatened to collapse their shelter. As night fell, the true scope of their isolation became clear. The storm was merciless, and the temperature plunged even further. Elias shivered uncontrollably, wrapping himself and the dog in layers of clothing and whatever scraps of insulation he had in his pack. He pressed his body close to Shadow, feeling the warmth of the small animal seep into his chest. It was more than comfort, it was life. The dog's heartbeat was a metronome against the silence, a reminder that there was something to fight for. He whispered promises to the dog that he barely believed himself. "We'll make it. Somehow, we'll make it through this." Sleep came in short bursts, punctuated by coughing fits and the constant roar of the wind. When he woke, the first light of dawn revealed a world he barely recognized. Snow had fallen even deeper during the night, covering the meager shelter they had created. Every landmark was gone. Elias' legs ached from the effort of digging and moving. His fingers were numb and stiff, but he refused to succumb. Hunger was gnawing at his stomach, but he had no food left. He rationed the tiny amount of snow he allowed himself to melt and sip, knowing dehydration could be as deadly as the cold. Over the next few days, Elias developed a rhythm. He learned to read the wind to gauge the depth of the snow, to anticipate where weak ice or hidden crevasses might be. Shadow became more than a companion. The dog became a guide. When Elias paused, uncertain which way to go, Shadow would sniff the air, listen to some distant sound, and choose a direction. More than once, Elias realized that following the dog's instincts had kept them both from danger. It was a silent partnership, one built not on words but on trust and necessity. Yet every day brought new challenges. A frozen stream that seemed safe would crack under weight, plunging Elias into icy water and robbing him of precious warmth. Wolves prowled in the distance, their haunting howls carried by the wind, a reminder of the predators always nearby. Once, a large branch fell with a deafening crack just inches from them, sending Shadow bolting in terror and Elias collapsing in exhaustion. He began to understand that survival was not a single act of courage, but a series of careful choices, a constant vigilance against 1,000 small dangers that could kill him if he faltered even slightly. The old man began to reflect on his life as he moved through this frozen purgatory. Memories of warmth, family, and home mingled with the harsh reality of the present. Each thought of the past was a double-edged sword, comfort in remembrance, but pain in knowing it was gone. Shadow pressed against him during these moments, silent and steady, a grounding presence that reminded him that life persisted. He whispered to the dog, sharing his memories, talking about long-ago winters, about the people he had known, and about the loneliness that had always lingered in the corners of his heart. Shadow listened as best as a dog could, tilting his head, letting his eyes shine with an uncanny understanding. Days stretched into a week. Each day was a careful balance of movement and rest. Elias scavenged what little food he could find. Frozen berries, the occasional small rabbit Shadow caught, even bark from certain trees he knew were edible. He rationed carefully, measuring each morsel, each sip of melted snow, knowing that miscalculating could mean death. Frostbite crept inexorably along his toes and fingers, the cold biting deeper with every exposure. Pain became a constant companion, dull yet persistent, a reminder of the fragility of flesh against the winter's fury. The storm did not relent. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Snowdrifts rose like small hills, ice formed jagged spikes on every branch, and the wind carried the scent of death, of animals and of trees snapped in half through the endless white. Yet through all this, Elias moved forward, propelled by determination, necessity, and the silent encouragement of Shadow. Every night, as they huddled together in makeshift shelters, he felt a small surge of hope when he looked into the dog's eyes. There was life there, stubborn and unyielding, and as long as Shadow survived, he had a reason to fight. By the end of the second week, Elias had learned to anticipate the subtle shifts in the storm. He could sense when the wind would drop for a few precious minutes, when the snowfall would lighten enough to move safely, when the ice might hold his weight. These small victories, seemingly insignificant, were life-saving. Shadow became more daring, scouting ahead in ways the old man could not, finding dry wood, detecting hidden dangers, and occasionally surprising Elias with a small prey animal to eat. Their bond deepened in ways neither could express. Survival had forged a partnership of necessity, loyalty, and silent understanding that went beyond words. Even with these small successes, the challenges mounted. Hunger never fully abated. The cold never fully relented. Elias' body was weakening. Simple movements were agonizing, frostbite spreading, muscles cramping, energy fading. Yet he pressed on. He had learned long ago that survival was as much a mental game as a physical one. Despair would kill him faster than hunger or frostbite. Every step, every breath, every careful choice was a victory. And Shadow, ever vigilant, never left his side, a constant heartbeat against the white silence, a reminder that even in this frozen wasteland, life could endure. The sky had darkened once again, though Elias hardly noticed anymore. Time had become meaningless, measured only by the relentless gusts of wind and the crushing weight of snow pressing against every surface. The storm that morning was unlike any he had faced before. Blinding flurries whipped sideways, visibility disappearing into a wall of white that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. Each step was a struggle. Snowdrifts towered like frozen walls, and the cold gnawed relentlessly at his fingers and toes. His coat, layered and heavy, offered little protection against the merciless wind. Shadow pressed close, but even the dog's fur, thick though it was, could not fully shield him from the biting chill. Elias moved cautiously, probing each step with his walking stick, testing for hidden crevasses or patches of fragile ice that could give way without warning. One misstep could plunge him into a frozen stream or beneath a hidden snowdrift, where death would be immediate. He stumbled once, his boots sliding over an unseen patch of ice, and instinctively caught himself with his hands. The pain shot up his arms, but he forced himself to continue. Shadow whined briefly but did not leave his side, nudging Elias forward with small, encouraging nudges. The dog's presence was more than companionship now. It was survival, a tether to life itself in a wilderness that seemed determined to erase them both. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Elias tried to light a fire beneath a cluster of overhanging branches. The wind screamed, carrying snow that extinguished every spark. Each failure left him more desperate, his body trembling uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Hunger gnawed at him incessantly, and his stomach churned as he rationed what little he had left. The snow beneath his feet was melting in some places, only to refreeze as jagged ice, threatening to cut through boots and skin alike. Shadow shivered against him, and Elias realized with a pang that their survival was precarious, hanging by the thinnest of threads. The first night of the storm was brutal. The wind tore at the crude shelter he had constructed, branches snapping and shifting under the weight of accumulating snow. Elias hugged Shadow tightly, trying to transfer what little warmth he could muster to the dog, but the cold penetrated deep into their bones. Sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching predator, every crack of ice a potential death sentence. He whispered softly to Shadow, not for comfort but for focus, repeating the same mantra over and over. "We survive. We survive together. We survive." The dog responded with a quiet whine, pressing closer, as if understanding the gravity of the words. By the second day, frostbite had begun to take hold more aggressively. His toes were numb, fingers stiff and unresponsive. Every motion was painful, and the simple act of gripping his walking stick required immense effort. The storm showed no mercy, pushing him and Shadow to the limits of endurance. Visibility was so low that Elias often lost sight of the dog for brief moments, each separation sending a surge of panic through him. He called out, voice cracking and raw from cold, and Shadow would always return, whining but unharmed. That simple reunion brought brief moments of hope, fleeting but enough to keep him moving forward. Food remained scarce. Elias had scavenged frozen berries and small amounts of bark, but it was barely enough to sustain energy. One morning, he discovered a rabbit trapped under a thin layer of ice, and with Shadow's help, he managed to capture it. The tiny meal brought immediate relief, but also a bitter reminder of how desperate their situation had become. Hunger gnawed constantly, and the body weakened under extreme cold burns calories faster than they could be replaced. Elia's stomach twisted painfully as he calculated each ration, knowing that one misstep could mean the end. The storm persisted for days. Snow accumulated in impossible quantities, covering every landmark, transforming the landscape into an unrecognizable frozen maze. Elias had to navigate by memory, though even that was failing under the constant whiteout. Hallucinations began to creep in, fleeting images of trees that weren't there, voices calling from the snow, the warmth of a fireplace he had not seen in decades. Each hallucination was a test, a distraction, and he learned quickly to ignore them, though ignoring was no easy task when exhaustion and cold combined to wear down the mind. Shadow, ever vigilant, stayed close, his small body pressed against Elias' chest, grounding him in reality when his mind threatened to betray him. At one point, Elias slipped near the edge of a frozen river, ice cracking ominously beneath his weight. Shadow barked sharply, a warning, and Elias froze. The ice groaned and shifted, and for a heart-stopping moment, he feared he would plunge into the freezing water. Using his stick and sheer will, he managed to pull himself back to solid ground. His heart raced, blood pounding in his ears, but he knew that in the frozen wilderness, such close calls were not anomalies, they were reality. Each misstep could be the last, and yet they pressed forward, driven by instinct, loyalty, and the desperate desire to survive. As the days stretched on, Elias and Shadow developed an almost wordless communication. The dog would sniff the wind, pausing, alerting Elias to approaching predators or unstable ice. Elias would follow Shadow's lead, trusting his instincts over his own faltering judgment. Wolves howled in the distance, but the dog's vigilance and the old man's careful movement kept them safe. They scavenged what little food they could, sometimes going days without a proper meal, living off melted snow and occasional frozen berries. Their bodies grew thinner, energy waned, and the cold became almost unbearable, yet they survived. One night, the storm reached a fevered pitch. Snow whipped sideways with such force that even crawling beneath a broken pine felt inadequate. Elias' fingers and toes were nearly numb, his lips blue, and every breath a struggle. Shadow pressed tight, trying to transfer warmth, whining softly as if urging him not to give up. That night, Elias experienced the closest thing to despair he had felt since the storm began. The wind screamed, the snow threatened to collapse their shelter, and for the first time he wondered if survival was even possible. But in the small, beating heart of the dog, he found resolve. He whispered, "We make it. We have to. Just one more day." And somehow, against every odds, they endured. By the end of the storm, Elias and Shadow were battered, frozen, and starving, but alive. The old man's mind was a haze of exhaustion, yet a spark of hope persisted. The storm had tested them to their limits, nearly breaking their bodies and spirits, but they had survived. Survival, he realized, was not about strength alone. It was about perseverance, trust, and the bond between them. And as they emerged from the worst of the storm, white snow stretching endlessly around them, Elias looked down at Shadow and felt something he hadn't in weeks. A flicker of optimism, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, they could endure this frozen nightmare after all. Days turned into a blur of white, each one nearly indistinguishable from the last. The storm had passed, but the world remained trapped in frozen silence. Snow covered every trace of movement, burying footprints, landmarks, and hope beneath a crushing blanket. Elias moved cautiously, each step a monumental effort, his body growing weaker by the hour. Frostbite had claimed most of his fingers and toes, leaving them stiff, swollen, and painfully sensitive. Every time he tried to grip his walking stick or gather a branch, sharp pain shot through his hands. His lips were cracked and blue, his cheeks raw from the wind, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, a constant, throbbing ache in his stomach that no amount of melted snow could soothe. Shadow stayed close, a small barrier of warmth against the biting cold. The dog's fur was frosted at the edges, and yet his eyes remained sharp, alert, scanning the endless white for danger or sustenance. Elias whispered softly to him as they trudged through the snow, "We keep moving. We survive, we make it." The words felt hollow at times, a fragile thread against the storm of despair that threatened to swallow them both. But Shadow responded with a small nudge, a reminder that he was not alone, that together they had a chance. They scavenged what little food they could find. Frozen berries clung stubbornly to ice-laden bushes, small and bitter, barely sustaining them. Occasionally, Shadow caught a rabbit or a bird hidden beneath the snow, and Elias would prepare it over a tiny makeshift fire, barely enough to warm the meal before it was consumed. The rituals of survival became their only focus. Each morsel of food, each sip of water, each small act of warmth was a victory against the endless white. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at Elias' insides, reminding him how fragile life had become in this frozen wasteland. Sleep was fleeting, a few minutes here and there, broken by shivering fits or the sound of wind tearing through the skeletal trees. Elias' mind began to play tricks on him. He saw shapes in the snow, shadows of animals, branches twisted into grotesque forms, figures that vanished the moment he blinked. Sometimes he swore he heard voices, distant and calling, only to realize it was the wind through the hollow trunks. Hallucinations became his constant companion, a torment that tested the boundaries between reality and imagination. Shadow, ever vigilant, stayed close, pressing against him, a living tether that kept Elias grounded in the real world, reminding him that despite the illusions, they were still alive. The physical toll was relentless. Frostbite worsened, gnawing at fingers and toes, spreading toward his legs and hands. His muscles ached, joints stiffened, and every movement became a calculated effort. He learned to shift weight carefully, to avoid slipping on ice, to conserve energy while still moving forward. Shadow adapted as well, moving cautiously over the treacherous terrain, occasionally returning to Elias' side with small offerings, a partially frozen rabbit, a branch with edible bark, as if reminding him that even in this frozen hell, life found a way to sustain itself. One evening, as darkness descended, Elias and Shadow huddled under a fallen tree, a flimsy barrier against the wind that still roared around them. He whispered to the dog, recounting memories of warmth, of home, of the long-forgotten comforts of life outside this frozen cage. He spoke of his youth, of winters survived with less, of lessons learned in the forest that now seemed distant and impossible to apply. Shadow listened as best as a dog could, pressing closer, eyes bright despite the frost, a living reminder that even in the harshest conditions, loyalty and companionship could endure. Despite their small victories, the threat of predators remained ever present. Wolves roamed the distance, their haunting howls carried by the wind, a constant reminder that one misstep could be fatal. Elias had to remain vigilant at all times, using Shadow's instincts as a guide. On more than one occasion, he nearly stumbled into traps hidden beneath snow or onto weak ice, only to be alerted by the dog's sudden growl or bark. The bond between them deepened in ways words could not capture. Survival had forged a silent understanding. Elias provided knowledge, experience, and human ingenuity, while Shadow provided instinct, intuition, and unwavering loyalty. Weeks passed in this relentless rhythm. Elias and Shadow moved slowly, carefully, scavenging what little they could, enduring cold that gnawed at every inch of their bodies, and battling the isolation that threatened to break their minds. They became attuned to the nuances of the forest, the subtle changes in wind direction, the faint signs of animal movement beneath the snow, the fragile patterns of ice that could bear weight or give way. Every decision mattered, every movement could mean life or death. The frozen wilderness had no mercy, no pause, no consideration for age or experience. Survival was earned through constant attention, through vigilance, through the unbreakable bond between man and dog. One particularly grueling day, Elias and Shadow encountered a near-fatal incident. Crossing a snow-covered ridge, Elias misjudged the stability of the ice beneath his feet. The surface cracked with a loud, horrifying snap, and he fell through, plunging waist-deep into icy water. Shock surged through his body, freezing him instantly, and panic threatened to take over. Shadow barked and scrambled on the unstable ice, whining, circling, urging Elias to move. Summoning every ounce of strength, Elias clawed his way out, dripping, shivering violently, muscles screaming, frostbite intensifying with every movement. He collapsed beside Shadow, gasping, feeling the thin thread of life stretching, nearly breaking. Yet he survived. This incident became a harsh lesson, a reminder that the wilderness demanded respect, attention, and constant vigilance. Elias adapted his methods, moving with even greater care, relying heavily on Shadow's instincts. The dog became a partner in the truest sense, guiding, alerting, and comforting him in a way that no human could. And while hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion continued to challenge them, they endured. Day by day, step by step, they pressed on through the endless white, surviving by a delicate balance of luck, instinct, and sheer willpower. By the end of these weeks, Elias' body was frail, battered, and scarred by frostbite, hunger, and exposure. Yet his mind remained alert, focused, and unbroken. Shadow's presence had become inseparable from his own survival, a constant source of warmth, companionship, and hope. In the vast expanse of the frozen wilderness, where most would have perished long ago, an old man and a dog had carved out a fragile existence, surviving against the impossible odds of nature's harshest winter. They were weary, cold, and starving, but alive. And as Elias gazed into the endless white horizon, he knew that the true test was far from over, that the frozen wilderness still had countless trials to throw at them, and that their survival depended on vigilance, courage, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog. The frozen wilderness had grown ever more treacherous. Elias and Shadow had survived the relentless storm, endured weeks of hunger, and battled frostbite that crept painfully along their extremities, but the forest was far from done with them. Wolves prowled the distance, their haunting howls echoing through the endless white, a constant reminder that even as they survived, they were being hunted. Elias had learned to read the faint tracks left in the snow, signs that danger lurked unseen. Every rustle of the wind through the trees set his nerves on edge, every snapping branch a potential death sentence. Shadow stayed close, ears alert, teeth bared at the slightest hint of movement. One morning, as dawn broke through the gray haze, Elias spotted them, 3 wolves moving silently over a ridge, their fur blending with the snow, eyes glinting with hunger and intelligence. He froze, heart hammering, knowing that one wrong move could trigger a chase that neither he nor Shadow could survive. He whispered a quiet warning to the dog, "Stay close, don't move until I say." The wolves stopped, sensing the presence of something unfamiliar. Elias' breath clouded in the cold air, the icy wind making each inhale a sharp, painful effort. He scanned for escape routes, knowing that moving too quickly could provoke the predators. Hours passed, the wolves circling at a distance, testing, observing. Elias and Shadow huddled behind a snowdrift, barely daring to breathe. The old man's body ached from exhaustion, hunger gnawed at him. Frostbite stiffened his fingers and toes, yet his mind remained razor-sharp. He had faced death many times over the past weeks, but the wolves brought a different kind of terror, one that was patient, intelligent, and unyielding. Shadow growled softly, a low rumble that reminded Elias of the stakes. Survival would require every ounce of their cunning, every instinct honed by weeks in the frozen wild. Later that day, they navigated a frozen river, its surface cracked and treacherous. Elias tested each step with his stick, but the ice groaned ominously, threatening to give way. A misstep would mean plunging into the icy water below, and for a moment, panic surged through him. Shadow moved cautiously beside him, pausing when Elias did, sensing the instability beneath their feet. The river stretched endlessly, and each careful step demanded focus beyond exhaustion. A sudden crack echoed beneath him. He froze, heart pounding, and shifted just enough to avoid catastrophe. Shadow barked, small but sharp, as if scolding him for the near mistake. Predators were not the only danger. Deep snow hidden crevices, frozen branches that could snap under pressure, and hidden ice-covered streams presented constant threats. Once, Elias nearly fell into a concealed hollow, only to be yanked back by Shadow's frantic tug at his coat. The dog had become both guardian and guide, a living map of survival instincts that Elias had come to trust implicitly. Without Shadow, he knew he would have succumbed to the frozen wilderness long ago. Hunger had reached a desperate peak. The small meals they scavenged were barely enough to sustain energy. One day, Elias found a frozen hare trapped beneath a snowdrift. Shadow pounced first, but the old man managed to snare it, using it to provide a fleeting meal. Each bite was cold and tough, but it reminded Elias that they were still alive. The struggle to find food was relentless. Each day, the wilderness seemed determined to strip them bare, testing every skill, every decision, every ounce of resolve. As the weeks dragged on, Elias and Shadow faced a storm unlike any they had yet encountered. Blinding snow swept through the trees, the wind howling like a chorus of ghosts. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the landscape transformed into a swirling vortex of white. They huddled beneath a fallen tree, but branches shifted and cracked under the weight of accumulating snow. Elias' body shivered uncontrollably, his muscles aching, fingers and toes stiffening further with frostbite. Shadow pressed close, shivering as well, their warmth intertwined, a fragile shield against the relentless cold. During this storm, Elias encountered one of his closest brushes with death. Attempting to cross a ridge obscured by drifting snow, the ground beneath him gave way. He tumbled down a hidden slope, rolling through snow, branches, and ice. Pain exploded through his body, bruising and cutting him in multiple places. For a terrifying moment, he lay still, barely able to breathe, fearing he had fallen too far to survive. Shadow barked frantically, nudging him, biting gently at his coat to urge him onward. Summoning every remaining ounce of strength, Elias dragged himself upright, inch by agonizing inch, until he found solid footing. He collapsed again, gasping, heart pounding, and realized with grim clarity that survival demanded more than endurance. It demanded ingenuity, caution, and unbreakable will. The wolves returned later that day, circling at a distance, eyes gleaming. Elias froze, knowing any sudden movement could provoke a lethal chase. Shadow growled, teeth bared, ready to defend them if necessary. They moved cautiously, step by step, navigating through the frozen terrain, the danger never far. Even as exhaustion and hunger gnawed at his body, Elias understood that the fight for survival was constant. The wilderness tested him relentlessly, offering no reprieve, no mercy. Each step, each breath, each movement carried consequences that could end life instantly. By the end of this harrowing week, Elias and Shadow had survived not only the elements but the hidden predators, the ice hazards, and near-fatal missteps. The old man's body was battered, bruised, and painfully frostbitten, yet his mind remained focused. Shadow had proven himself a guardian in every sense, alert, vigilant, and loyal beyond measure. The bond between man and dog had grown to something deeper than companionship. It was trust, instinct, and an unspoken understanding that survival depended on both of them. And yet, even as the threat of predators receded and the storm passed, Elias knew that their journey was far from over. Hunger persisted, the cold remained unforgiving, and the frozen wilderness held countless dangers still. They had survived the first true trials of the winter, but greater challenges awaited. Each day was a delicate balance of courage, vigilance, and the quiet, unyielding determination that had carried them this far. They moved forward together, a fragile lifeline in a world that had shown them little mercy, yet offered the faintest glimmer of hope. That survival, against impossible odds, was still possible. Elias and Shadow had endured the worst the frozen wilderness could throw at them, and yet the forest seemed to test them further with subtle, quiet threats. The days were endless stretches of white, punctuated only by the biting wind and the constant ache of hunger. Frostbite clawed relentlessly at his fingers and toes. Each step was a monumental effort, and the cold seeped into his bones as if determined to freeze him from the inside out. Shadow pressed close, a small, steadfast source of warmth and hope. The dog's presence had become inseparable from survival itself, a heartbeat in a world that had otherwise forgotten mercy. One morning, as dawn's pale light filtered weakly through the frozen canopy, Elias noticed a faint trail of tracks in the snow. They were subtle, partially covered by fresh snowfall, but unmistakable, the prints of small animals, rabbits and perhaps squirrels, winding through the trees. A spark of hope flickered in his chest. If he could follow the tracks carefully, he might find prey to sustain them for more than a day. Shadow's ears perked up, tail flicking with anticipation, and Elias felt a surge of determination he hadn't experienced in weeks. Survival was still possible. They just needed patience, careful observation, and a little luck. The next hours were painstaking. Elias moved slowly, probing the snow with his stick, careful not to disturb the fragile trail. Shadow darted ahead occasionally, sniffing, barking softly when he found something of interest. Together they tracked the small animals, careful not to startle them too early. Eventually their efforts paid off. A rabbit, trapped in a shallow hollow beneath the snow, froze in place as Elias approached. With a precise, practiced motion, he captured it, heart hammering with relief. It was a meager victory, but one that felt monumental after weeks of near starvation. Shadow wagged his tail, barking softly, as if celebrating alongside him. The small meal revitalized Elias more than he expected. Hunger still gnawed, but the body's sharp edge of despair softened slightly. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to think beyond mere survival. He considered routes through the forest that might offer more consistent shelter, streams where water might not be frozen solid, and areas where wildlife could be abundant. Shadow moved beside him, alert and eager, as if understanding the shift in mood. They were no longer only reacting to the forest. They were planning, adapting, reclaiming a sense of control over their destiny. As days passed, these small victories accumulated. Elias discovered patches of frozen berries that were surprisingly edible once warmed slightly, thin strips of bark from certain trees that could be chewed for sustenance, and caches of small rodents hidden beneath the snow. Each find was a reminder that the wilderness, while brutal, could also provide. Shadow became an invaluable partner, sniffing out prey, alerting Elias to danger, and offering companionship that eased the crushing isolation. The bond between man and dog deepened, forged in the crucible of survival, trust, and shared hardship. Elias began to reflect more on his life, memories blending with the stark reality of the present. He remembered winters long past, of family gatherings by the fire, of laughter and warmth, of lessons from his father about reading the forest and listening to its subtle signs. These memories were bittersweet, reminders of comfort and loss, but they also fueled his determination. He spoke to Shadow of these times, telling stories aloud, almost as if sharing the burden of memory could lighten it. The dog listened silently, eyes bright and attentive, a living presence that anchored him to reality even as fatigue and hallucinations threatened to erode it. One evening, as the sky turned an ominous shade of gray, Elias and Shadow stumbled upon a partially collapsed cabin, hidden beneath snow-laden trees. The structure was fragile, barely intact, but offered shelter from the wind in a way that branches and fallen trees never could. He cleared away snow and debris, dragging the dog inside, and for the first time in weeks, they were protected from the relentless gusts. The warmth of the small space was negligible, but it was enough to let them rest, to regain some strength, and to plan the next steps. Shadow curled beside him, their bodies pressed together, sharing warmth and comfort in a way that felt almost sacred. Inside the cabin, Elias found remnants of human life, old tins of preserved food, a few tools, and a worn blanket. Though many of the supplies were spoiled or frozen solid, it was a revelation. They were not entirely alone. There was a hint that the world beyond this frozen prison had once touched this place. He rationed what could be salvaged, melting snow for water, and using the small scraps of food to stave off hunger. Shadow, ever patient, watched him with attentive eyes, as if understanding the significance of the discovery. The small cabin became a sanctuary, a place where survival felt tangible rather than a constant struggle against despair. Days in the cabin allowed Elias to regain some physical strength. Frostbite remained, but careful attention slowed its progression. He improvised small tools and traps, preparing for future hunts, and explored the surrounding forest in short, controlled excursions. Shadow led the way, sniffing out prey and alerting Elias to potential dangers. The small victories built momentum, a sense that survival was not only possible but achievable with careful strategy and constant vigilance. For the first time since the storm began, Elias allowed himself to believe that perhaps they could endure this frozen wasteland and see warmth again. Evenings were spent recounting memories and dreams, conversations spoken aloud in the silence of the cabin. Elias spoke to Shadow about his family, his youth, and the lessons that had shaped him. The dog listened attentively, a silent confidant in a world where human contact had vanished. In these quiet moments, the bond between man and dog transcended survival. It became emotional sustenance, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, loyalty, companionship, and hope could endure. The turning point had arrived. Elias no longer moved merely to survive. He moved to reclaim life in the frozen wilderness. Each small victory, each meal, each safe night of shelter reinforced the possibility that they could endure. Shadow remained at his side, a constant and unwavering presence, a living symbol of perseverance. And as Elias gazed into the endless white forest from the cabin doorway, he felt a cautious optimism. They had survived the storm, avoided predators, navigated treacherous ice, and found sustenance in the unforgiving wild. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, survival felt like more than mere endurance. It felt like a tangible goal, achievable through determination, cunning, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog. The frozen wilderness had hardened Elias and Shadow, yet it had not released its grip. Weeks of unrelenting cold, hunger, and exhaustion had pushed the old man to the brink, and the body he once trusted so implicitly now threatened to betray him. Frostbite had spread further, each movement sending waves of agonizing pain through fingers and toes that were swollen, numb, and darkened by the relentless cold. Muscles ached, joints stiffened, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Shadow remained close, a living reminder that survival demanded vigilance, loyalty, and courage, even when despair whispered seductively in the silence of the snow. One morning, Elias discovered a hidden trap he had not noticed before. A thin crust of ice covered a deep crevice, nearly invisible under the fresh layer of snow. Step too far and he would fall to the bottom, a jagged pit that promised death in an instant. Shadow froze beside him, ears perked, body tense, and Elias realized that the dog's instincts had once again saved them from disaster. Every nerve in his body screamed caution, yet hunger drove him forward. He moved inch by inch, testing each step, holding his breath with every crack of ice beneath his boots. The crevice stretched for meters, a frozen trap that demanded patience, precision, and the combined instincts of man and dog. As he carefully navigated the treacherous ridge, a sudden blizzard descended, faster and more violent than any they had yet faced. The wind tore at his coat, snow whipped into his eyes, and visibility dropped to almost zero. Shadow pressed close, whining softly, a mixture of fear and encouragement. Elias stumbled, nearly losing his balance on the fragile ice, and the realization hit him like a blow. One wrong step could end everything. His hands and feet were nearly useless from frostbite, every muscle screaming in protest, yet he forced himself onward, gripping the stick with the last remnants of strength. Night fell in a whiteout, and they were forced to huddle under a sparse clump of pines, barely enough to shield them from the wind. Elias' body trembled violently, a mix of cold, hunger, and sheer exhaustion. He pressed Shadow close, seeking warmth from the small, steadfast dog. Each heartbeat seemed magnified in the silent forest, each breath a battle against the cold that threatened to steal life itself. The dog's fur pressed against his chest, a small pulse of vitality in a world that seemed determined to erase them. The next day, hunger drove Elias to desperate measures. He scavenged frozen branches, stripped bark, and foraged for any trace of edible vegetation. Shadow helped, sniffing out the faintest signs of prey. Finally, they found a small rabbit trapped beneath ice and snow. Elias' hands trembled as he prepared it, the first real meal in days, sustaining them enough to continue. The relief was brief but powerful, and for a moment the world seemed less hostile. The forest still demanded respect, vigilance, and cunning, but survival had proven possible once more. Yet danger never rested. Wolves returned, prowling silently in the distance, their eyes glinting with hunger. Elias and Shadow moved cautiously, the dog leading the way, sniffing the wind, alerting him to every subtle change in the landscape. One misstep could trigger a chase that neither could survive. Shadow's presence was a lifeline, an extension of instinct and vigilance that complemented Elias' experience and careful planning. Together, they navigated the frozen forest, avoiding predators, ice hazards, and treacherous terrain. The emotional toll weighed heavily. Elias' mind teetered between hope and despair, memories of warmth and home mingling with the harsh reality of frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. He spoke aloud to Shadow, recounting tales of youth, winters survived, and family long gone. The dog listened silently, eyes attentive, ears flicking at each sound, grounding Elias in reality when hallucinations and fatigue threatened to overtake him. The bond between them had grown beyond companionship. It was a shared determination, a mutual reliance, and a silent understanding that survival demanded both courage and loyalty. Days later, the blizzard finally lifted, revealing a transformed landscape. Snow drifts were higher, ice more treacherous, and every familiar landmark buried beneath layers of white. Yet amidst the desolation, Elias noticed faint signs of human presence, a distant plume of smoke, a trail of footprints, a structure partially hidden by snow. His heart surged with cautious hope. Could this be a sign of rescue? Perhaps help had arrived, or another human had survived the winter in this vast, frozen wilderness. Shadow barked excitedly, nudging him forward, and Elias felt a renewed sense of determination. They approached cautiously, every step a calculated risk. The landscape remained treacherous, and exhaustion weighed heavily, but the possibility of human contact, warmth, and sustenance pushed them onward. Each step brought them closer to a potential breakthrough, a chance to escape the relentless cycle of survival, hunger, and cold that had dominated their lives for weeks. The forest, though unforgiving, had not defeated them. They were battered, frozen, and starving, but alive. And for the first time in weeks, Elias allowed himself to believe that survival might lead to something more: safety, warmth, and perhaps the end of this relentless winter nightmare. By the end of this patch of their journey, Elias and Shadow had survived not only the elements but predators, ice hazards, and the relentless tests of the wilderness. Each small victory, a meal, a safe crossing, a night survived in relative shelter, had built resilience. The old man's body was battered, his frostbite severe, but his mind remained sharp, fueled by the growing hope that rescue or at least safer ground awaited. Shadow remained at his side, unwavering, a constant heartbeat of life, loyalty, and trust. Together, they faced the final trials of the forest with determination forged in the crucible of weeks spent surviving against impossible odds. The frozen forest stretched endlessly, but Elias felt a shift in the air. The blizzard had passed, the wind softened, and the sun's weak rays reflected off the snow, creating a dazzling, almost surreal brightness. For the first time in weeks, warmth, however faint, brushed against his frostbitten skin. Shadow barked softly, ears twitching, tail wagging cautiously. Something had changed. There was movement ahead, subtle, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, the signs of life beyond the frozen wilderness. Elias' heart pounded as he squinted into the distance. Smoke curled gently above the treetops, a thin gray ribbon against the white landscape. Could it be a cabin, a hunting lodge? Another survivor. For weeks, he had dreamed of such a sight, a glimmer of human presence that promised warmth, food, and safety. Every nerve in his body urged him forward, and Shadow, sensing his excitement, bounded ahead, sniffing the air, returning occasionally to nudge Elias onward. Step by step, they moved cautiously, aware that even this final stretch was treacherous. Ice patches, hidden crevices, and snow-laden branches threatened to undo all their progress. As they drew closer, the source of the smoke became clearer. A small cabin, partially buried beneath heavy snow, stood amid a cluster of pines. Its roof was cracked, chimney crooked, yet smoke rose steadily, a sign of life, warmth, and hope. Elias' body trembled, not from the cold, but from relief and anticipation. He approached cautiously, every step measured, aware that any sudden move could lead to injury. Shadow darted ahead, sniffing the perimeter, alert to any danger. Their senses, sharpened by weeks of survival, guided them safely to the cabin door. Inside, the cabin was modest but intact. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. Shelves held jars of preserved food, blankets, and tools, remnants of human life that offered immediate sustenance. Elias sank to the floor, exhausted, shivering violently despite the fire's warmth. Shadow pressed against him, sharing what little body heat he could offer. For the first time since the ordeal began, Elias allowed himself to relax, to let his guard down, to feel relief that was more than temporary. They were not alone. A man, rugged and kind-eyed, emerged from the shadows, carrying a lantern. He froze for a moment, taking in the sight of the old man and the dog, both battered, frostbitten, and weary beyond words. "You made it," he said softly, approaching carefully. Elias could barely speak, lips blue and cracked, but managed a hoarse whisper. "We survived." Shadow wagged his tail weakly, panting, as if acknowledging the presence of another human who could provide safety. The man guided Elias to a chair, helping him remove the layers of ice-covered clothing. Water was melted, food offered, and warmth slowly seeped into the old man's body. Shadow curled beside him, finally able to rest fully, no longer required to provide constant vigilance. The cabin became a sanctuary, a place where survival no longer demanded every ounce of strength and attention. The frozen wilderness had tested them, nearly broken them, but here, relief and safety were finally within reach. Elias reflected on the journey, the weeks of blinding storms, the freezing nights, the frostbite, hunger, and relentless danger. He thought of the wolves circling, the ice traps, the near falls into frozen crevices, and every moment where death seemed imminent. And yet, through every trial, Shadow had remained unwavering, loyal beyond measure, guiding, comforting, and protecting. The bond between man and dog had grown beyond survival. It had become a testament to trust, perseverance, and resilience. Days passed in the cabin, and Elias regained strength. Frostbite slowly healed, his body restored with food, warmth, and rest. Shadow, healthy and alert, continued to provide companionship, now free from the constant pressure of survival. The cabin became a place not only of physical safety, but of emotional recovery, a symbol that hope could endure even in the harshest conditions. Elias spoke of his journey aloud, recounting the ordeal to the kind-eyed man, the memories of near death and perseverance etched into every word. Shadow listened, occasionally lifting his head to bark or nudge Elias, a reminder of the shared struggle that had brought them here. Even as warmth returned and life normalized, the memories of the frozen wilderness lingered. Elias understood that survival was more than enduring the cold. It was resilience, ingenuity, vigilance, and the bond with Shadow that had made the impossible possible. Each meal scavenged, each near miss avoided, and each step taken across treacherous snow and ice had forged a story of endurance that would remain forever in his mind. The forest had tested them, nature had challenged them, but the ultimate lesson was clear. Survival required more than physical strength. It demanded courage, hope, and unwavering trust in those who shared your journey. Finally, one crisp morning, Elias stepped outside the cabin with Shadow by his side. The sun glinted off the snow, illuminating the forest in sparkling brilliance. He inhaled deeply, feeling warmth on his face and a sense of accomplishment that transcended exhaustion. They had survived, endured the frozen wilderness, and reached safety. Shadow barked softly, nudging Elias forward, ready to explore the world beyond the trials that had nearly claimed them. And as they walked together, the bond between man and dog stronger than ever, Elias knew that they had not only survived, they had triumphed against the odds, proving that resilience, loyalty, and courage could overcome even the harshest winter's fury. Even as warmth returned and safety seemed secured, Elias could not shake the remnants of the frozen wilderness from his mind. The memories lingered, vivid and unyielding. The relentless storms, the hidden ice traps, the haunting howls of wolves, and the endless ache of hunger gnawing at his insides. Each recollection brought a shiver, though the fire now crackled warmly beside him. Shadow lay curled at his feet, ears twitching as if he too remembered the terror and the cold, the nights spent clinging to survival with nothing but instinct and sheer will to guide them. Elias rose slowly, every movement a reminder of the weeks spent on the brink of death. His frostbitten fingers still throbbed, a sharp reminder of the harsh reality that had tested him beyond endurance. Yet, each ache, each scar, each memory also carried a sense of triumph. They had survived the impossible. He looked down at Shadow, who wagged his tail weakly and nuzzled against him. "We made it," Elias whispered hoarsely. The dog's eyes met his, bright with intelligence, loyalty, and understanding. In those eyes, Elias saw not just companionship, but the reflection of every trial they had overcome together. The cabin, now a sanctuary, became a place for reflection and cautious recovery. Elias explored its contents more thoroughly, finding journals, notes, and remnants left by previous inhabitants. He read carefully, discovering stories of other travelers who had braved the wilderness, each account a reminder that survival was not merely physical but mental. The ability to adapt, to persevere, and to maintain hope when every instinct screamed despair. Shadow sniffed each corner, alert even in safety, a living reminder that vigilance had been their ally and would continue to guide them until every scar healed. Days stretched on, and Elias began to plan for the journey beyond the cabin. Though immediate danger had subsided, the forest remained unpredictable. Snow could fall again without warning, ice could form treacherously over hidden crevices, and predators still roamed in distant shadows. He could not afford to forget the lessons learned in patience, observation, and trust in instinct. Shadow remained at his side constantly, leading the way when they ventured out for small explorations or to gather firewood. Each step beyond the cabin was measured, deliberate, and informed by the countless near misses that had defined their survival. One afternoon, as Elias ventured farther than before, he stumbled upon a frozen stream partially thawed by sunlight. Small fish darted beneath the ice, a rare sign of life. The sight sparked a fragile hope, a reminder that the forest, while harsh, was also full of hidden resources for those who knew where to look. He caught a small fish, prepared it over a fire, and shared it with Shadow. The dog devoured it eagerly, tail wagging, and Elias felt a surge of gratitude. The simple act of sustenance, once so fraught with peril, now carried a sense of triumph and reassurance that life, even in the harshest winter, could endure. Elias also reflected on the psychological journey. Fear, hallucinations, and isolation had tested him in ways that physical hardship never could. Shadows on the snow became shapes of monsters, wind whispered threats in his ears, and exhaustion blurred the line between reality and imagination. Through it all, Shadow had been his anchor, keeping him grounded when the wilderness sought to unravel his mind. The dog's loyalty, intuition, and unwavering presence had become the invisible lifeline connecting Elias to hope, reason, and the will to survive. Night after night, Elias sat by the fire, recounting the days of the frozen wilderness aloud, speaking as much to himself as to Shadow. Each story was a catharsis, a method to process the trauma, and an acknowledgement of the resilience that had carried them through weeks of relentless struggle. He remembered the moments when death seemed inevitable, the blinding blizzards, the wolves circling in the distance, the treacherous ice, and the near misses that could have ended everything. And yet, in every story, there was also triumph. The small meals found, the shelter discovered, the instincts relied upon, and the unbreakable bond that had ensured their survival. One day, as the sun pierced the clouds with rare intensity, Elias noticed movement in the distance, human movement. Figures appeared faintly, distant yet unmistakable, approaching through the snow. His heart raced. Could it be rescue? He called out hoarsely, waving arms weakly, and the figures responded. Shadow barked excitedly, racing to the edge of the clearing, tail wagging furiously. Elias felt a mixture of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. Weeks of near death, relentless cold, and isolation were about to end. The forest had tested them to the utmost limit, but their perseverance, cunning, and the bond between man and dog had carried them through. As the figures drew closer, Elias realized they were rescue workers, equipped with supplies, blankets, and warm clothing. They approached cautiously, helping him to his feet, assessing injuries and wrapping him in insulation. Shadow remained close, but allowed himself to be leashed and guided, recognizing the shift from survival to safety. Tears ran down Elias' cheeks as he took in the warmth, the human presence, and the tangible relief of not having to battle the wilderness alone. Survival had been hard, cruel, and relentless, but now it had a satisfying closure. Even in rescue, Elias reflected on the journey. Survival was more than enduring the cold. It was resilience, ingenuity, and trust in himself, in instinct, and in Shadow. Every moment of hardship had forged a story of perseverance, courage, and the quiet triumph of life over the harshest winter. Shadow remained steadfast, a living symbol of loyalty and partnership, a reminder that even in isolation, hope could endure through companionship and determination. The frozen wilderness had tested them, but it had not defeated them. They had endured, survived, and emerged stronger, bonded by trials that few could imagine. Elia stepped carefully onto the path that led away from the cabin, Shadow by his side. Every step was deliberate, muscles stiff, joints aching, yet the weight of fear and uncertainty had lifted. The forest, though still blanketed in snow, no longer seemed hostile. The blinding white that had once felt like an endless prison now glistened with quiet beauty. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and the air carried the subtle warmth of the approaching sun. Elias inhaled deeply, feeling the frozen grip on his body loosen ever so slightly. The rescue workers guided them through the forest carefully. Elias moved slowly, supported when necessary, but Shadow led the way with instinctive precision, sniffing, alert and attentive. Each step forward reinforced a profound sense of relief. The wilderness had tested them, but they had endured. Frostbite still tingled painfully in his fingers and toes. Hunger was only partially eased, and fatigue pressed heavily upon his body. But Elias felt an unparalleled sense of accomplishment. They had survived weeks in one of the harshest winters imaginable, and now the world of warmth, food, and human contact awaited them. As they reached the edge of the forest, familiar signs of civilization emerged. A dirt road, partially cleared of snow, ran toward distant hills, where smoke from chimneys marked the presence of homes. Elias' heart surged. Months of isolation, relentless struggle, and near-death experiences had culminated in this moment, a bridge from survival to safety. Shadow barked softly, his eyes bright, tail wagging, sensing that the danger had passed. Elias bent down, pressing his forehead against the dog's fur. "We did it, boy," he whispered. "We survived." The rescue workers led Elias to a nearby lodge equipped for winter emergencies. Warmth enveloped him, a sensation nearly forgotten in the frozen wilderness. Blankets were draped over him, hot tea placed in his hands, and nourishment provided for his weakened body. Shadow, covered in frost and snow, received attention as well, a bath, food, and warmth, allowing him to shake off weeks of cold and fatigue. Together, man and dog rested, surrounded by human care for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The sense of safety was profound, yet Elias' mind still lingered on the lessons of survival, the bond with Shadow, and the unforgiving wilderness they had left behind. In the days that followed, Elias recovered slowly. Frostbite began to heal, muscles regained strength, and the shadow of starvation lifted. Yet the emotional scars remained, a reminder of the weeks spent fighting for life, facing predators, navigating treacherous terrain, and enduring isolation. He spoke often of the journey, recounting details to anyone who would listen, but always with Shadow close by. The dog had not only been a protector, but a companion, a friend, and an unspoken lifeline. The survival story was theirs together, etched into memory and experience alike. Elias reflected on the lessons learned. The wilderness had demanded everything: endurance, ingenuity, vigilance, patience, and emotional strength. Each small victory, from scavenging food to avoiding predators, had been hard-earned. He realized that survival was never solely about physical prowess. It was about mental fortitude, adaptability, and trusting instincts, both his own and Shadow's. The bond with the dog had been critical, a partnership forged under extreme conditions that few could comprehend. Eventually, Elias was able to reconnect with the outside world. He contacted distant relatives, received medical attention for frostbite and malnutrition, and shared his story with local authorities and wilderness experts. Shadow remained by his side, now more than ever a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and courage. Their story became a quiet legend in the nearby villages. The old man and his dog who had survived against the deadliest winter, navigating snowstorms, predators, and isolation to reach safety. As spring approached, The forest began to thaw, and the memory of the frozen ordeal shifted from immediate trauma to reflection and gratitude. Elias often walked with Shadow along safe paths, teaching younger travelers and hikers about the perils of winter wilderness. He recounted his experiences, emphasizing caution, preparation, and respect for nature. And in every story, Shadow's unwavering presence was a central theme. The dog who had not only survived but guided and comforted through weeks of hardship, exemplifying the power of companionship in even the most desperate circumstances. One quiet evening, Elias sat by the fireplace in the lodge, Shadow curled beside him. He stared into the flames, thinking of the endless snow, the blizzards, the ice-covered crevices, and the wolves circling in the distance. Each memory was vivid, a testament to survival, courage, and the relentless challenge of nature. He reached down, stroking Shadow's fur, and whispered, "We made it through everything, together." Shadow lifted his head, eyes meeting Elias, a silent acknowledgement of the shared ordeal. The story was complete, not with fanfare, but with the quiet triumph of life persevering against impossible odds. Elias knew that the wilderness would continue to test others, that snowstorms would rage, and that many would not survive. But he also knew that survival was possible, with courage, careful planning, mental strength, and unwavering companionship. Shadow lay at his side, warm, alert, and faithful, a living reminder that even in the harshest conditions, hope endured. And as the lodge fireplace crackled, Elias finally allowed himself to rest fully, knowing that weeks of terror, struggle, and resilience had reached their conclusion. The journey had been brutal, yet through every challenge, they had emerged alive, bonded, and forever changed by the frozen wilderness they had conquered together.